So one of the things that I um, like to talk about is the fact that it doesn't take much time in nature to reap the reward. And so right now we're in a little bit of a different world where we are doing a lot of these Zoom calls, right? And a lot of virtual things. And so what I wanted us to do is start the presentation by doing a little bit of grounding ourselves. And while I was kind of hoping that this presentation we could have done like somewhere outside, but since we're here all together on Zoom, I just want to take a few minutes to just listen and absorb some of the senses that we can in nature. And I'm going to play a little bit of a nature scene for us all to take a moment to unwind. So I'm going to start it. Hopefully it works. And I hope that, even in those few minutes, like, I know for me, like I was feeling really amped up and a lot of adrenaline's going through my body right now because I'm presenting to you and, that gets us going. But I could take a couple of deep breaths and use some of my senses. Of course, watching a video, you're not using all your senses, but we could use our sight and our hearing to listen to the birds and to see the trees and the beautiful flowers. And that's kind of the power of what we're going to talk about for the next little bit. So what is our connection to the natural world? And one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, writes, "Hello, sun in my face. Hello, you who made the morning and spread it over the fields. Watch now how I start the day in happiness and kindness." Our connection to nature stems back, for some of us, from our childhood. For others, it might have been something we developed later. And for some others, maybe it's something that they haven't even developed yet. And this is something that we start to think about. And so when you think about nature, think about how you interact with nature and where you go to find it. And if you do that, what does that place look like and where is it? For some of us here in Monmouth County, New Jersey, we feel very connected to water and the ocean. So a lot of times when I have these conversations in my class, the ocean is a place where people go to sit and reflect. But I also am going to ask you to think a little bit more deeply in terms of how well you know your place in space. And so in our work, we think about our place in space and how we're connected and grounded to it. So the other thing we think about is how well we know the history of our place. So I've done a little bit of research here. I just recently moved to Monmouth County, and I've done some research in terms of who lived here before me. And one of the things, of course, I noticed right away is that in my little town, in Middletown, in the street that I live near, there's a lot of what's called historic homes that date back to the 1600s and 1700s. But there were people that lived here before that. And so that's the important piece too, to think about in the United States in particular, the indigenous people, the Native Americans that lived here before us. So the Native Americans of New Jersey in general, and in Monmouth County in particular, were the part of a Lenape people. And the origins of their tribe kind of still dot our area in Monmouth County, and you can know that in the towns' names like Portapac, Navesink, Rumson, Matawan, Manasquan, Takanasi, Wanamassa, to name a few. And the Lenape were part of a Delaware tribe. And historians using radiocarbon dating materials on artifacts such as spear points and tools. So archaeologists have been able to trace the Native American population of Monmouth County back 12,000 years. And according to Dr. Paul Boyd, who is an Atlantic Highlands historian who research covers the Lenape in Monmouth County during the 1600s, he says, quote, all the largely autonomous bands of Native Americans living on the New Jersey shore in those times were part of the wider Lenape group, which extended over all of New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, northern Delaware, and southeastern New York. And according to Dr. Boyd, he actually did his doctoral dissertation on the Lenape people and wrote a book called Atlantic Highlands from Lenape Camps to Bayside Town. And the Lenape were seasonal dwellers. They moved throughout this whole area. And during the shore season, they were fished, and they hunted and farmed and traded, and they were peaceful people. And there were about 7,000 Native Americans who were living in New Jersey in the 1600s. However, by the time of the American Revolution, there were fewer than 60. So that's a little astonishing and also not surprising, knowing kind of the cultural history and the colonialization of the American lands. But it's important to know, kind of have a deep understanding of where you are in your place. I took a class recently on ecopsychology, and one of my professors talked about, his name was Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and he talked about like really getting to know his place in space. And one thing he did, which I found really astonishing and also really interesting, is he went out every morning and sat in the same place for an entire year. And he watched it change every day and through the seasons. And I thought he feels really deeply connected to that place. And I don't know about some of you, but I know that you might feel that way. Maybe it's in your hometown, maybe it's a park near you, maybe it's in a place that's steeped in your own heritage. For me personally, I remember going back to my family's from Ireland, and I remember going to Ireland for the first time and feeling very deeply connected to the place, even though I really had never been there before. And so Dr. Chalkwist talks about those connections that we have to our place on the earth. So speaking of those connections, some of the other things we think about as our earliest memories in nature. And this is a picture of my family on Mount St. Helens a few years after it actually erupted. You can see it probably looks really different right now. I can't really think. I think it was maybe in 1981 we were standing there. My parents were teachers, and our summer vacations were spent usually camping. And so because of them, I developed a real connection to the natural world. We often spent our time, mostly probably because we couldn't afford the hotels and those sort of things, doing those kind of camping adventures or going to Stokes State Forest, which is one of my favorite places in New Jersey, and we would go up there every summer. We also did 2 very long cross-country trips in a VW Vanagon, if you can imagine that, with one of those sunroofs that cranked totally open, where you took the tape and you divided the van so that my brother sat in the back, and he was not able, he was not allowed to touch my space, right? So, but we did 5-week trips across the country, and we camped along the way. And it was, those are the memories I'll tell you, like from my childhood, that I remember the most, and I know that they completely kind of informed the person that I am today. And so I ask you, like, what are your earliest experiences in nature? And what kind of memories does that invoke? And are there particular feelings that come to mind when you think about nature? Now, something to keep in mind is that not everybody has positive interactions with nature. In fact, I was talking to a friend recently who had been trying to get camping with me forever, and she grew up in Newark, and she told me that she was scared of nature. She was scared of the parks because it wasn't a safe place for her to go. And so for her, associating nature, she associates, as a child, her association was with fear. And so not every client that you might work with might have earliest memories of nature that are positive. There's other people you'll talk to whose early experiences of nature were, a place where they found refuge. I've talked to people who their home life was chaotic, or, there was abuse happening, or it was not good, and they would go out to find a place in nature, or they'd sit under a tree or go to a park to escape and find kind of solace in the natural world. But to be an ecotherapist, really exploring your early memories of nature, what they mean to you, and how they kind of shaped who you are now. And just to share a couple more funny pictures of me, after college, in college, I took a semester off and did a course with the National Outdoor Leadership School, which is an organization based in Lander, Wyoming, that's been around probably since the 60s. And it's an organization that takes, it's very similar to Outward Bound. If you've ever heard Outward Bound, Outward Bound is like a well-known company that does the same thing. It takes people out into the natural world to build resiliency and teach leadership school, but also kind of perpetuate concepts of, best practices in the wilderness for leaving no trace. So going into the wilderness and coming out of it without impacting it at all. And so I learned, I did a semester course with Knowles in Kenya in 1993. And we spent a few months in Kenya. And so the picture in the corner is me on top of Mount Kenya, actually. And yes, that's snow in Africa. It was wild. We started at the base in 95 degrees, and it took us a month to hike to the top of Mount Kenya. And we had to carry all of our gear because while it was hot at the start, it was cold at the end. We got to the top. It was fantastic. And so I spent a month on Mount Kenya, and then we hiked through the Masai Mara, and we sailed on the Indian coast. And it was an unbelievably amazing life-changing experience for me. And after I did the Knowles course and I came back, and it was a hard adjustment. I know some of you have gone to India and felt this adjustment when you come back. And it's an interesting adjustment back. But I did a couple of years where I was a wilderness therapist for a bunch of different companies. The one in the middle, you can find me, kind of look like the teenagers behind me. But I worked for the National Wildlife Federation, and I also worked for Outward Bound, and I worked for Aspen Achievement Academy, which were companies that were kind of peppered throughout the country. So I lived in North Carolina, I lived in Minnesota, I lived in Utah, and I lived in Colorado doing the work. And we took children out, teens out into the wilderness, and it varied. Sometimes I would do 8 days, sometimes 15, sometimes 30. And then the folks in Utah, they were 60-day programs where we took these children out, these kids out, and a lot of the times they were coming out of juvenile detention centers, and they opted into our program in order to reduce their sentence, perhaps in the juvenile detention center. And the transformation was absolutely incredible. And I was just a 20, 21, 22, 23-year-old kid, you know, in charge of these, you know, these teens, and not trained, obviously, as a counselor, but I watched their bodies and their minds change. I watched the group dynamics. I knew there was something going on here that was super special. And it stayed with me. And after I lived outside for a while, I decided I wanted to live inside. And I moved back home here to New Jersey. And I spent a couple of years in the corporate world. And I was like, this was not for me. Like, I could not sit still. I had a horrible time sitting in a cubicle. Cubicles were big, you know, at the time. And I was a miserable person. And actually, I was in New York City on 9/11, and after that experience, I was like, I need to do something different. And that's when I went back to school to go to Montclair State. And at Montclair State, I took a class in eco-psychology, and it really actually changed my world, because one of my favorite professors, Dr. Gloria Pierce, taught the class, and this was in in 2002, and so it wasn't very well known, and I connected the dots and everything that I felt, you know, so it made sense to me, all the work I did out west and the concepts that I learned that I'm going to be teaching you or telling you about today. Okay, so when we think about these things, we think about our modern world, although our modern world right at this moment is a little different. I suppose everybody in the city would have masks on, but I don't even think that there's that many people in the city right now. But, you know, as a species, we've lived thousands of years with an intimate relationship with the natural world, right? So the understanding of our surroundings was critical to the survival of the individual, the tribe, you know, your species as a whole. So the rapidly changing kind of industrialization of our world, our species and our brains still are primed for survival, right? So we can still read each other's facial expressions for universal signs of, is this person safe? You know, we don't always get the answer right, but our red flags go up. We smell food to make sure it's okay to eat. We have reflexes that instantly react to something falling, you know, and our brains go into a fight or flight reaction at the sense of threat. These were things that were adapted to us over hundreds and thousands of years, right, for our survival. But many of those connections to nature now, when we think about it, have shifted in our modern world. And as a result, we've really retreated inside. So according to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the average American spends 93% of his or her day, of their day inside. So that's 7% of our day outside. And that is a significant decrease in the last few decades, right? So 7% is an alarming rate to me. And that I did the math, and that only it equates to 1/2 of 1 day per week, 1/2 of 1 day per week outdoors. And if you aggregate those statistics, that means the majority of our adult living, we spend 339 days a year completely indoors. I mean, we can think of all the things that correlate with that, right? I mean, I'm sure you're thinking about 10 right now. It's, you know, our crazy world and where we have to work, and the fact that we have all this technology on our fingertips. And those are all reasons that this shift has happened. They also project that by 2050, 66% of the world population is projected to live in cities. I don't know. It's something to think about. I don't know how this pandemic might shift some of that, but we shall see. So before we go into ecotherapy and ecopsychology, which is what I want to talk to you about first, I want to give you a little, if you have like, just take a minute and I'm going to ask you some questions. And this is from a scale called the Connection to Nature scale, which is by Mayer McPherson in France. And so here are some questions I'm going to ask you. It's only a couple. And so you can rate, if you want to write it down on a piece of paper, you can take your, you can write down how you answer, and it's a Likert scale from 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree, okay? So answer, it's simple, there's no right or wrong answers. You simply state as honestly and candidly as you can what you're presently thinking about. So number 1, I often feel a sense of oneness with the natural world around me. Again, 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree. 2, I think of the natural world as a community to which I belong. I recognize and appreciate the intelligence of living organisms. When I think of my life, I imagine myself to be part of a larger cyclical process of living. I often feel kinship with animals and plants. I feel as though I belong to the earth as equally as it belongs to me. I have a deep understanding of how my actions affect the natural world. I often feel part of the web of life. I feel that all inhabitants of Earth, human and non-human, share a common life force. Like a tree can be part of a forest, I feel embedded with the broader natural world. When I think of my place on Earth, I do not consider myself to be a top member of a hierarchy that exists in nature. I often feel like I am only a small part of the natural world around me, and that I am no more important than the grass on the ground or the birds in the trees. My personal welfare is not independent of the welfare of the natural world. And so at some point you probably could you can add up those scores. Obviously, if you answered all 5, that would be a strong probably connection to nature, and see where you're at. And when we tell you to do this, you know, if you're going to become ecotherapists, because you have to understand your connection to nature and where you feel you are with it, and how it might look to you to either explore further your connection or to understand some of your limitations. So let's get into the heart of the theory. So ecopsychology is a concept that was, the term itself was brought to kind of the literature by a man named Theodore Roszak, who was a historian in training, but was largely credited in coining the term from his 2001 book called The Voice of the Earth. And the goal of ecopsychology, according to Roszak, is, quote, to bridge our culture's long-standing historical gulf between the psychological and the ecological, to see the needs of the planet and person as a continuum. Now, let's keep in mind that we're talking about, you know, Americans in general, the people in general. Like indigenous cultures have a long history of being very connected to the earth. So we're talking about the loss that we see and the lack we see in kind of our industrialized world. So at the time that he started thinking about this, other scholars, including psychologists Mary Gomez and Alan Kanner, were discussing kind of similar themes in their work. And so together, these three authors got together and edited an anthology called, right here on this page, Ecopsychology, Restoring the Earth and Healing the Mind. And what they did is they gathered thinkers from a bunch of different disciplines to further expand on the connection of humans and nature. And they wrote the anthology aimed to look at just not just the human experience, but to see how we can expand that into psychological wellness, right? And so that was part of the process. He called it the greening, Roszak called it the greening of psychology. And he argued that if humans were really to understand ourselves consciously and unconsciously, like you can't ignore that which supports, sustains, and provides for us, which is our earth. So these scholars really framed ecopsychology within the intersections of these two movements, because at the time there was the environmental movement that was really prominent, still is, and then with psychotherapy, right? And so we know environmentalism, of course, is the movement throughout the world that addresses the scientific, political, and societal influences and how we protect and conserve our planet. And so ecopsychologists argue that we can't not connect that to our mental health. At the same time that these scholars were writing that book, Howard Kleinbell was writing a book called Ecotherapy, Healing Ourselves, Healing the Earth. And this was published in about 1996. And he was one of the first to coin the term, again, ecotherapy. And a lot of his work and the work of other ecopsychologists at the time really was influenced by spirituality. So Howard Kleinbell really conceptualized ecotherapy as ecological spirituality. And very much like the Roszak and some of his other collaborators, he really did believe, of course, that our relationship with nature must be reciprocal. And this is a key concept into the work we do. So as nature has the ability to heal us, we have the ability to heal nature. So he called this concept the ecological circle, stating that experiencing this, he says, enlivening energy can enhance people's love for the natural world, deepen positive bonding with the earth, and add an earthly grounding to your spirituality. In other words, it can bring all of life down to earth. So what he talked about are three concepts. He talked about in-reach, up-reach, and outreach. And you'll hear these kind of concepts repeated, throughout we talk about different scholars. So when he says in-reach, he means opening ourselves to be more intentionally nurtured by nature, right? So reaching within. Upreach, he says, refers to the energizing spiritual awareness that can motivate and empower us to engage in the often difficult tasks of outreach, which he describes as participating with others in action that will help save the planet, action that is an essential aspect to the holistic contextualized therapy and education we describe all along in this presentation, right? So in-reach, ourselves, up-reach, kind of our spiritual awakening, and outreach, giving back. Peter Kahn and Patricia Hasbeck are other people that have written on this topic. I happened to have met Patricia at a conference recently, and she's a psychotherapist out in Oregon, has been doing this work for over 20 years. And they wrote a book called Ecopsychology, Science, Totems, and Technological Species, and they've incorporated a lot of technology into the theory. And I know Patricia did a lot of research on what nature via electronics does, such as some of the things that we did in the beginning of the presentation. We looked at that, and she did some work in instilling nature themes and nature videos in prisons and other things like that. But they really kind of succinctly summarize the major tenets of ecopsychology, and they're here on this slide. I'll read them to you too. So that unconscious processes exist, including those of identification and repression, not only in relations with other people, but to the earth itself. Direct sensorial experience with the phenomenon of nature constitute a foundational source of knowledge, joy, and a full realization of human potential. As proposed by the theory of Gaia and in deep ecology, human life is interdependent with other human life and with the non-human world. Interaction with nature helps lead to optimal mental health and psychological development, often through developing inner peace, compassion, and trust, and providing a medium for engaging in selfless service. Interaction with nature benefits people physically and physiologically, and we are biological beings with an evolutionary history, and that many patterns of thought and action that formed through co-evolving with nature in evolutionary history are still with us. And to flourish, we need to connect more deeply to wilderness. That's something we'll talk about in a little bit. So what is the research out there on our connection to nature, right? There's so much research that have been done, in particular about our connection to nature. And so research has been conducting on our physical health, our mental health, our occupational functioning, or how well we do in office spaces and work environments, our cognitive functioning, social and emotional well-being, play and play behavior, and conservation attitude and social justice, right? So we'll talk a little bit about what some of those research findings in, but I want to share with you first I'm going to share a video by Richard Louv, who wrote this book, Last Child in the Woods. And he's a journalist that researched kind of the connection to nature and children, right? And what he found, and I'll let him tell you first, but what he found really is that children are what he called experiencing nature deficit disorder. Okay, that's not a technical term, but we'll hear him talk about it.
What are we doing to kids? We're creating environments for kids at school and at home in which they are using fewer and fewer of their senses, that they're down to a couple senses, staring at that screen, using their ears and mainly their eyes to allegedly go anywhere in the world through the internet. We're creating an environment in which I believe, by definition, they are less alive. What parent wants their child to be less alive? What teacher wants their students to be less alive? I spent a lot of time in the woods with my dog. My parents didn't know where I was, but my dog did. And I found something bigger there than my parents and their problems. I found something large. I have a bias from growing up to associate time spent in nature with happiness for a family and with health, particularly mental health. There's not very much research yet on autism, but I can't tell you how many parents have come up to me and said, you know, I read Last Child in the Woods. We have an autistic child or a child with Asperger's, and we started getting our child outdoors more, and there's been a change. I hear from teachers all the time. For years now, I've been hearing this. The troublemaker in my class, when I get the class outdoors into nature, the troublemaker becomes the leader. Not just well-behaved, the leader. I hear that over and over again. It raises a question. What are we doing to these kids by keeping them in the classroom all the time, in that cubicle, at that chair, taking test after test after test, canceling recess, canceling field trips, all with this theory we're going to make a better child if we do that to them. But what proportion of the huge increase in the number of kids that are taking stimulants, pharmaceuticals, drugs, for their behavior, what proportion of that huge increase might have something to do with the fact that we took nature away from kids in the first place. Nature experiences are in some ways just as important as anything else in a child's development, and they have a human right to that experience in nature. So nature deficit disorder is a phrase that has caught on, and I didn't really expect that to happen, but it has. That's not a known medical diagnosis. Maybe it should be, but it's not now. I always point that out. What it is a language to use, a way to describe this feeling we've had for a long time about that disconnect from nature that those parents, even some kids, told me about beginning in the late 80s and early 90s. Some of the most recent research has certainly linked lack of nature in people's lives to such problems as vitamin D deficiency. Recess has been cut, physical education has been cut in US schools. What are we thinking? Let alone get the kids outdoors in a natural setting or taking them on a field trip to, a state park. We're having those kids sit all day, and sitting is the new smoking, and guess what we're doing to them?
So he researched and wrote this book, Last Child in the Woods. It was written in 2005. And I still have some of my classes, actually one of my classes just recently read the book. And I think a lot of what he wrote, even now it's almost, 15 years ago, is still really resonates, in a lot of what we're saying. And there's lots of different reasons for that too. But it's just something to think about. And what I like, one of the things that came out of his book and the popularity of the book and the popularity of the movement has been more thought and like deeper thinking about how we connect, best ways to connect children in particular with nature, how to take kids from places like urban environments that don't have access to nature necessarily into natural spaces, how to create urban spaces, safe spaces too. And so their organization, he created an organization called the Children in Nature Network, which is a global organization that, champions the movement, is one champion of the movement, but also became like a real, aggregate of all the research. And what they've done is really amazing infographics, and I'm going to share a couple with you. Just these can come right from their website, and they're downloadable. And what I'll tell you is that if you need to share them with administrators, maybe in schools or places that you work, all the information is there. And so some of the research they succinctly talk about is how nature provides health and well-being for babies, right, with fetal growth and healthier birth weights, and vitamin D and healthy eyes, increasing in physical activity, reduction of obesity. Children are better able to cope with stress when they're near trees and other greenery, social emotional well-being, right, improved in relationship skills, reduce stress, anger, and aggression. Other research has been done on academics and behavior. So again, better academic performance and learning in natural environments can help boost performance in reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. And you can see there's 5 citations there. They can enhance creativity and critical thinking and problem solving, enhance focus and attention, and reductions in ADHD symptoms, increased enthusiasm for learning, greater engagement with learning, and has an effect on impulse control, and is correlated with less disruptive behavior. I actually teach a lot of my graduate level classes, as some of you know, in natural spaces as much as I can. And I notice these things even in graduate school students, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Here's another beautiful infographic about nature play and the benefits of nature, how to create nature champions, right? Getting people outside and being the advocate, perhaps, or the person that teaches them how to do that skill as an adult. So I actually just recently did a presentation for the Girl Scouts, and so that's something that Girl Scout leaders do and Boy Scout leaders do very well, is championing that connection to nature. And that's important as parents, as aunts and uncles, as caregivers, we can kind of demonstrate that. And so the benefits of that is social skills and health and self-esteem and grades, right? But here there are a lot of infographics also from their website that talk about green schoolyards. So if you work in if you're a school counselor or you work in a school setting, you know, how green schoolyards can help kids feel calmer and less stressed, positive and restored and resilient, right? So you can take some of the research they've gathered for all of us and use that perhaps if you're advocating for change in your place. So the other thing I want to talk about is the concept of climate stress and eco-grief, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about with that interconnection in terms of eco-psychology and if you're paying attention, you have to have some stress over what's happening with the natural world, right? And so Sandra Kahn, who was part of the book that was written by Rosak and his colleagues, she wrote a piece about this then, and she asks, like, when the earth hurts, like, who's responding, right? Who's taking care of the earth? And so if you are, like I said, paying attention, like the ailing planet really can weigh heavy on our minds, whether that's conscious or subconscious, you know, or unconscious. And that we can have this deep-rooted anxiety for the planet's health, right? And can the planet really sustain our growing demands and exploitations? And so we talk about eco-grief or climate stress when we watch the Earth and its inhabitants suffer. We witness loss of lands. We witness the extinction of species. We have increased fear caused by global warming, and we see that, you know, with bigger and stronger storms, things that are more damaging and harmful and kill people and destroy natural spaces and actual cities and all kinds of different things like that. And overconsumptionism. And that really, what Sandra Kahn really talks about is that she says that because we've lost our community, our place, and our connection to nature, she thinks we're filling it with substances and purchases and shopping, gossip, maybe even celebrity culture, right? So we feel this like loss of community and we're stuffing it with other things. But I've talked at Monmouth, I did a talk recently and about environmentalism and about, you know, global warming, and it was a room full mostly of scientists, you know, really passionate, super intelligent people who research the changing planet, right? They study the ways the oceans are changing. They study what's happening to species. They watch species they study suffering, right? And I have to tell you that I was the only one in the room at the time really talking about the impact on our own mental health, right? And what I saw really intensely was how the people studying the earth and the changing environment were suffering, you know, from stress. It's like watching someone that you care about die of something that you can't help them, right? And so we talked about that and how it impacts our own health. And so Joanna Macy talks about eco-sanity, right? And she talks about a 3-part prescription for eco-sanity. And I learned this actually in the class that I recently took with Dr. Linda Boiselle, who I'll talk about in a little while. And she introduced me to this idea of eco-sanity, but Johanna Macy's been writing about this for a long time. She's an author and a teacher. She's a scholar of Buddhism and systems thinking and deep ecology. And she's a respected voice for peace, justice, and ecology. And she interweaves her scholarship with learning from 6 decades of activism. And her wide-ranging work addresses the psychological and spiritual issues of what we're in now, which is the nuclear age, and the cultivation of ecological awareness and the kind of resonance between Buddhist thought and postmodern science. And so the dimensions of her work are explored she wrote 13 different books. So one of the things she talked about in terms of eco-sanity is this reciprocal model again. And she says, okay, you have to have all of these pieces, but they none can be too heavy, right? So you have three things simultaneously. And one is, she calls holding action or activism. And this is this is things that you do to help, right? It could be doing something active, maybe in your local community or even larger, right? And that's your activism part. The other thing she talks about is structural change. So creating the good. For you, it could be gardening. It could be doing ecotherapy. It could be holding a vision of where we're going and what we're creating and feel good about your part of that work. So we have the power to do something, right? However small it might be, or whatever nuance it is that works with what you want to do. And then the third thing she talks about is a shift of consciousness, which is where you can get to define that for yourself. So some of that might be eco-spirituality, which we'll talk about in a little while. It could be yoga. It could be something interesting or intellectual. It could be whatever it is that fills your bucket, right? So what she says is that, again, you can't do much of that one thing or another. For example, if you're only out there doing activism, right, and protesting and, you know, talking to your legislators or participating in events or you know, writing to your congresspeople, whatever it is, and you don't take care of yourself or you don't do some smaller piece, then you're going to be burnt out in that one circle, right? Now, same thing, like if you only just do yoga, but you don't maybe take part of smaller and larger pieces to help sustain planet, then you're just maybe sitting just in one piece of it and not really actually impacting change. So sometimes we can get stuck in one of these areas. And she says, you know, in order to keep sane, right, we have to make sure that we have all three pieces in play. Another piece of the work is what's called ecofeminism. My daughter drew this picture. I love it. And so I want you to take a few minutes while you're here to write a few things down. So if you have a piece of paper and a pen again, I want you to take some time to write adjectives that described, and I'm being very gendered here, a woman or women. So what are some of the adjectives that come to mind? So maybe think of 5 or so. Now, next to that, take a few minutes to write adjectives down that are just typically used to describe the earth. So with ecofeminists, or who is a segment of eco-psychology movement, they tie humans' attempt at kind of those concepts, right? So maybe you thought of, when you wrote earth, mother, maybe you thought giving, maybe you thought nurturing, maybe you thought providing, but also maybe you thought unpredictable, right? Maybe you thought something that needs to be controlled. And ecofeminism really like links those ideas and it argues that kind of the Western paternalism, right, and anthropocentrism, which is that humans are first, right? That's the idea of anthropocentrism, is that there's a belief that humans first over all other pieces of the ecosystem. And they believe that that's led to this harmful split between nature and culture, and that the movement here, ecofeminists, really sees the connection between the domination of nature and the exploitation of women. It's a very similar kind of control, right? So ecofeminists discuss how the ways that the dominant society views and treats women is often parallel to societal views and treatment of the natural world, right? So Mother Nature is often depicted in media and other places as something unpredictable, needs to be controlled. There's been history of trying to control nature, damming water, you know, trying to stop animals from encroaching on human places and reducing all of the habitat, trying to control things like that. And that's what ecofeminists argue and think about. So another concept that we think about is eco-spirituality. And Lincoln, who wrote an article called Eco-Spirituality, suggested that eco-spirituality consciousness is associated in 5 ways to the human experience. So intent or attending, which is being fully conscious and present in the moment. Dwelling or being grounded and aware, which is being centered or focused thinking. Reverences or honoring the mystery of the earth or discovering the mystery in beautiful sacred creatures. And connection to the whole or unification with creation. And sentience or sense of knowing, the visceral intuition of knowing and connection. So eco-spirituality is based in a fundamental belief in the sacredness of nature and earth and the larger universe. So traditionally, eco-spirituality is argued to hold in its human on earth has been practiced by many centuries by indigenous people. And even in some of the earliest religious movements, it was also very, you think of pagan and that sort of thing, was all very much connected to nature. And only recently has that become a disconnect. And so eco-spirituality, it really is finding the spiritual connection that you have to the natural world and something that's larger than you. And it could be God, it could be spirit, it could be the Buddha, it could be divine. And it's the source, it's not just the source of all, it's a part of which we can connect to on a daily basis through our senses and experience kind of a greater awareness and wonder. And those of you who know Dr. Jodrey, she wrote a chapter about eco-spirituality. Of course, I had an expert right in front of me for the book that I wrote, so you can read that to learn more. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the theory, let's talk about the technique and the practice. So what is ecotherapy, right? So ecotherapy is also known as nature therapy or green therapy, and is generally seen as the applied practice of ecopsychology. So the thing about ecotherapy is that it can be done in many different ways. And this is the beauty of it, because you might like to do a certain type of thing. You might love animals. You might love gardening. Well, this is all under the umbrella of what we call ecotherapy, right? And ecotherapy really stems from the belief that obviously people are part of the web of life and that our psyches are not isolated or separated from our environment, right? We're getting this connection. So we're going to talk about play and children. We're going to talk about green exercise, horticultural therapy, wilderness therapy, animal-assisted therapy. We'll talk about forest bathing, some biophilic design. And before I get into that, I want to talk about Linda Bazell again, who I mentioned before, who wrote a book about ecotherapy. And she explains that ecotherapy, there's level 1, she talks about level 1 and level 2 ecotherapy. So level 1 ecotherapy really talks about like a human-centered nature therapy. So just going into nature and benefiting from its healing powers, right? And so that's fine, right? We can do that, and we should do it for our self-care, for sure. And level 1 ecotherapy work is healing, but it misses the critical piece. And that's what she talks about, level 2 ecotherapy. And she, again, kind of like Kleinbell talked about, she calls that the circle of reciprocal healing, right? So level 2 ecotherapy expands on that anthropocentric view of human existence, right? Using nature. We never use the word use nature, but she talks about a broader understanding of healing oneself involves healing the planet, right? So whatever we do, and when you think about it in terms of relationships, like we incorporate nature and the relationship that we have with nature as an example on how other relationships should look, right? So the natural world can heal us, and as a result, we are actively a part of healing the natural world, right? So those interactions are intentional. So horticulture therapy, for example, is your preferred thing to do. We use plants that are indigenous to our geographical location and benefit kind of local wildlife, right? If you're animal-assisted therapies, then you don't use an animal, right? You allow the animal to have space and freedom to interact with humans and clients, and you never force the interaction, right? So again, the concept is at level 2, we start thinking about that connection. And one of my friends, Kristen Huber, was a graduate of this program and an ecotherapist. She talks about a concept called take three for the sea. And because one of the things, and I know you probably all feel that when you go out into the natural world and you see trash everywhere, right? Like you just want to pick it all up. And again, we have to think about that circle of how much you can do before getting burnt out. And so this is a movement kind of originating in Australia by an ecologist and a youth educator, but it's become a part of my friend Kristen's therapeutic work, where we take 3 for the sea every time we go out, or we take 3 for nature, wherever you are, just pick 3 things up and bring them home with you. And if everybody did that, right, the place would look a lot different. But again, this is level 2 ecotherapy work, and she teaches that to her clients, and that becomes part of the process too. So again, she's modeling the behavior, and then her clients learn it too. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ecotherapy with children. So ecotherapy with children is a natural fit, right, for children. They love being outside. Most kids really love. I mean, even my cranky teenager, who I drag outside, once she's there, she is relaxed and she comes back feeling better, right? So it kind of works with all kids in every developmental stage. And what I'll tell you is that if you do play or you do play therapy, like bring the play outside. You have a bounty of natural toys out there that you can work with. And so when you think about every stage of development, the natural world can provide a boost to a child. Like an infant needs sensory inputs, right? Like smell, sounds, touch, and taste. But toddlers are more active, right? So they might need to really get out there, move, and develop their larger motor skills. And younger children might need activities that support their fine motor skills, or that stimulate their cognitive development. So they might need to build or dig or run or climb. Where older children, might be ready then to explore like their deeper connection to nature and start to think about, that. And for a lot of children, nature provides like a break from the structure, right? So we keep them regimented every day at school or home. And so being outside is like an open space where they can be free. And some things you can do in your practice, if you can do sensory play, right? So we know sensory play is really important for the child's development, and you can bring that outside. I know a therapist who has a sensory garden outside of her office, and she has things hanging and things moving and things to touch. All those things interact with all of the child, all the senses of the child. You can do grounding exercises outside. So you might help a child listen and relax and breathe to the sound of birds, the breeze, or a brook or stream. You can use nature as a metaphor, right? So from, thinking about, nature as a metaphor is a whole connection. There's so many metaphors in nature that you can use, but you can guide a child through a visualization, like standing tall as a tree and envisioning their roots growing into the earth. You could extend their arms like branches and gently sway. Again, we're grounding the child. One of the things I always suggest, if you can, is to take your shoes off and let the child get into the ground, right? And feel that, like, the connectivity between the earth. You can do sand play with children outside. You can make tensor tunnels with the natural world. You can do heavy work if you're doing some heavy work with kids, have them move some things around outside. You can do art therapy in nature and using nature, natural items, right, like to make masks, or all the different kind of art activities that we do with children. And so there's a lot of great books out there too that give you tons of fun ideas to do with kids. And so I highly recommend looking at, say, for example, the National Wildlife Federation has one called Nature Play at Home, a guide for boosting your children's healthy development and creativity. Well, as us as therapists, we can utilize that book too, for getting our kids and our children and our clients outside. Another form of ecotherapy is just real simple green exercise. And so we can assign this as homework to our clients, right? So research shows that kind of acute short-term exposures to light can those effects can take place in as little as 5 minutes. I'm going to show you one of my favorite books and authors. Her name is Florence Williams, and she wrote a book called The Nature Fix. It's just about her brain on nature, and I'll play you a little bit about what she has found in her research.
Walk into a forest, and within 5 minutes, your body and brain start to change. heart rate slows. Your facial muscles start to relax. Your hardworking frontal lobes begin to quiet down. And this will boost your productivity and creativity later in the day. I'm Florence Williams, and I've spent the last couple of years writing a book about how being in nature actually makes us more human. Here are some of the things I've learned from the new science looking at nature and our health. The smell of pine trees strengthens your immune system. When you hear birdsong or look at fractal patterns in nature, your brain puts out more alpha waves, making you feel both calm and alert. If you spend an hour and a half walking around living plants and animals, you'll be less preoccupied by your personal problems and feel more connected to people and the world around you. Finnish researchers say being in nature a minimum of 5 hours a month can make you happier overall. Why not give it a try? Go outside, go often, bring friends, breathe.
So I would recommend picking up that book or listening to it if you can. It's called The Nature Fix. It's amazing. She covers all the research that really connects like our brain and how our brain interacts with nature. But again, the effects can take as little as 5 minutes. She also talks about lots of research that is being done on like spending 3 full days in nature and how that has significant impacts on a brain's health, and how those that can be sustained, those changes can be sustained and felt in the stress reduction for over a month. And so that's just something to think about. Another type of ecotherapy we can do is horticultural therapy, right? And this is the most popular therapeutic interaction between people and plants. And it ranges from, appreciating gardens to actually gardening. And horticultural therapy dates back to Socrates, right? But it didn't become a scientific pursuit until the 18th century. And that's when a psychiatrist named Benjamin Rush, he was actually one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but he began to document how gardening benefited patients that suffered from mental illness. And so, still much of the science about how gardening affects our mind and brain is still kind of a mystery, believe it or not. But what scientists do know is that good gardening reduces stress and calms the nerves, and it decreases, that stress response that decreases cortisol, our hormone that plays a role in our stress response. And so whatever it might be that you do, I mean, they do horticultural therapy with seniors. They do it in people who are incarcerated. All these things have shown amazing effects, and you can do that with your clients. Grow a garden with them, or if you have the space to do that, or encourage them to do that on their own. I know a lot of people are scared and might think that they don't have a green thumb, but if there are plants out there that actually are less hard to kill. So, and they're in my book, but we researched that a little bit. Another interaction that you can do is, now this is a little bit more intense, and this is where I started my journey, to this work, but it's wilderness therapy, right? And so wilderness therapy utilizes the wilderness right? The wilderness as a context for healing. And wild and remote places really provide that context for individual and group therapy. And the goal of wilderness therapy is to challenge the participants, engage the responses to those challenges, and really work through a lot of kind of moments of frustration, in order to create these experiences where the participants can be reflective and self-aware and see and do amazing things and change, right? So the wilderness also offers us a pure distraction, when I mean modern distraction, free environment where a participant or a person that's doing wilderness work is physically and emotionally challenged. And if you've never done it, I would recommend it. Now, here's what I'll tell you, and this is something that we always have to think about whenever we do this type of work, is that the it's still wild, right? So you can't, if you don't know what you're doing, you have to be really careful. And always, if you've never done any of this before, bring a guide or bring somebody that knows what you're doing. But one of the things that Florence Williams researched was that 3-day effect. And what the scientists have found is that your brain needs a break from the technology and from our everyday stresses. And it takes only 3 days in nature for our brains to relax, right? And it was 3-day effect is a term that was coined by it was a bookseller. His name was Ken Sanders. And he saw, he used to take out people into the wilderness. He saw this tremendous shift, and he started talking to a friend that he knew that was a neuroscientist, David Strayer, and he teaches at the University of Utah. And so Dr. Strayer started studying this, and he found that the participants, had this increased ability to use their brain just after 3 days, and that kind of ability to kind of have less stress and be more creative lasted for over 30 days. It's really amazing. You can also go glamping. So if you don't want to really, get crazy with it, you can go glamping. So just keep that in mind. Another thing that we think about, and this actually resonates with so many people, is animal-assisted therapy, right? So animal-assisted therapy, as a lot of you probably know, is a therapy that involves animals as a part of treatment. And the goal is to improve, a client's social and emotional or cognitive functioning. And then advocates state that animals are really good at being educational and helping with motivation and helping with stress. And so, and also a therapist who brings a pet with them may be viewed as less threatening, and it could really help with rapport. So something to think about too, and this is something that we talked about already, is that we don't use the animals, right? So the animal has to be getting the benefit too, right? So one of the most amazing type of animal-assisted therapy is equine therapy, right? It's not for everyone because it can be a really powerful tool. So horses are incredible. They instinctively know our moods. And so I don't know if has anybody ever interacted with a horse? I mean, you cannot get a horse to do something, right, if it's not in tune with you, right? And you have to really, and it can sense your stress. And so equine therapy is really good for people, especially with PTSD and other stress-related symptoms, is that they have to really be in their body and be really calm in order to interact with the horse and have the horse interact with them. And of course, some of the amazing work that's done with veterans also uses horses that have had some kind of trauma. So I know of organizations that, adopt horses that might have been race horses or horses that have been mistreated, and together with, say, veterans, they heal each other. Temple Grandin, some of you might know, it talks a lot about that connection to animals, and she talks about how those who have less ability or inclination to communicate verbally, right? So if you have a client who might be on the spectrum, who is not, has less ability to communicate, she really talks about how they have an easier time relating to animals because of that, right? There's a nonverbal and powerful interaction that someone can have with an animal, and allows for someone to develop deep skills such as empathy, or having the ability to read nonverbal cues, right? So you have to be able to read the nonverbal cues in the animal. And that's kind of the beauty of animals and the beauty of nature, is that it's not judgmental, right? You can scream your problems into the wilderness and it's not going to judge you. You can whisper and let go of your problems into the horse's ear, and it will still love you. Same with the dog, right? So these are beautiful ways that we can let go and heal. Another beautiful space to do work is group work in nature. And a lot of that comes from the literature in wilderness therapy. And in wilderness therapy, the group work is an integral part of the therapeutic process. So you take a group out into the natural world, and you have to function together as a group in order to survive. But group work can be done in you can do your groups in nature too. Actually, two of my former students and I were going to do a nature-based group, was just about to launch before the pandemic hit. But that's something we had been working on and we're going to do together. And this is just some pictures of my class. And as many times as I can, I try to get us outside. All right, let's talk a little bit about Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. It's not involving a bathtub, okay? And don't think of those crazy commercials with the people in the bathtubs. It's nothing to do with that, right? This is a concept that really emerged from Japan. And Shinrin in Japanese means forest, and yoku means bath. And that's where the words come together. It's not exercise. This is not exercise. This is not jogging. This is not hiking. This is simply being in nature, connecting with it through our senses, through our sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. So Dr. Quinn Lee, he's an author of a book called Forest Bathing: How Trees Can Help You Find Health and Happiness. And so he talks about forest bathing, which is really a meditative practice. And where this came from is that in Japan and in Korea in particular, there were a lot of people in the cities who were super stressed out. They have a really stressful corporate culture in some of the cities. And so what they started figuring out is that they took some of the folks out into the forests and had them walk through the forest. They started studying, right, how the blood pressure of these people and how the stress responses of these people changed, right? And so literally they bring people in buses all the way out to the forest to have them do this forest bathing in order to reduce their stress. And here's how he says to do it, right? So we can do it ourselves. He says, first, find a spot. Make sure you have left your phone or your camera or both behind. You're going to be walking aimlessly and slowly. You don't need any devices. Let your body be your guide. Listen to where it wants to take you. Follow your nose and take your time. It doesn't matter if you don't get anywhere. If you're not going anywhere, you are savoring the sounds, smells, and sights of nature and letting the forest in. The key to unlocking the power of the forest is in the 5 senses. Let nature enter through your ears, your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your hands, and your feet. Listen to the birds singing and the breeze rustling in the leaves of the trees. Look at the different greens of the trees and the sunlight filtering through the branches. Smell the fragrance of the forest and breathe in the natural aromatherapy of phytoncides. Taste the freshness of the air as you take deep breaths. Place your hands on the tree of a trunk, dip your fingers or toes into a stream, lie on the ground, drink in the flavor of the forest, and release your sense of calm and joy. This is your 6th sense, a state of mind. Now you have connected with nature. Now you have crossed the bridge to happiness. So phytoncides, actually phytoncides, is actually what trees release, into nature and what we smell and feel. And there's correlations between that and the smell of it and our own sense of peace and being able to relax. And he says, Dr. Lee says, once you've practiced the art of forest bathing, you can do it anywhere. All you have to do is add trees. So it is of time. You don't know how many of you have ever taken time without your phone to just really aimlessly wander somewhere. I know that maybe that sounds scary, but maybe try it for a minute, 2, and work your way up. It might be really great. Another thing you can do, right, if we don't have access to nature all the time, and I get to ask this question all the time, okay, well, I can't take my clients outside, or we can't just aim mindlessly through a forest. What can I do to help, or bring ecotherapy inside? And some of that is called biophilic design, which is actually what interior designers and architects are starting to think about. And that is that interior design characteristics, so having high quality natural lights and window views if you can, including kind of natural elements, it's plants and natural colors and nature scenes into your office, And there's been studies done that actually, you know, that show that that can improve mood and increase concentration. And I think a lot about our if those of my students, our windowless rooms in the corporate park with the mustard yellow walls and the horrible desks and the weird green carpet. None of that has any form of biophilic design. And I don't know about you, but I often feel very suffocated in those rooms, which is one of the reasons why I try to take my classes outside as much as possible. But there's been a lot of studies done, especially in hospital settings, about that, and how having a view of nature or a window to look at can make you feel better. And they have studied that in corporate parks, corporate environments, and how that actually improves productivity with people. All right, so like, how can you connect to nature, right? What if you're not a nature person? I kind of get asked this too a lot. There's a lot of things you can do. You can play with a pet if you have a pet, right? So some people that I know are like not nature people, but are real dog people. Kind of the, you know, that's a part of it too. Take some time to watch the birds. Go to your favorite place in nature to find peace and think about that and get to know that space. Try adding some low maintenance houseplants or succulents to your home. Go for a hike by yourself or with your friends. I often prescribe nature to my couples. So when couples need time to themselves, and so maybe they go right to going out for dinner, or maybe you think of like going to the movies. I often prescribe a walk in the woods. It's cheaper and it's better for you. Take time to notice your surroundings. Get to know your county and state parks. Monmouth County, one of the things that I've loved about moving down here is I absolutely am in love with the county parks. They are gorgeous and there's so much to explore. And then of course I always say try camping. This is a picture of my daughter camping. And that might be a stretch for some people, but if you know someone who's good at camping, like ask them to take you, you know, go with somebody who knows what they're doing, because you want your experience, if you've never been camping, to be good. So you want to do it again. So can I be an ecotherapist? So the simple answer is yes, you can, right? You don't need to be an expert in ecology. You don't need to be an expert in forestry or environmental studies, but you do need to think about how to do it. So this is a common question I get a lot. So decide on a group to work with, right? Who is your population? And where would they work best? Pick a suitable place. Check on your paperwork insurance, and we'll talk about this when we talk about ethics. And talk about your clients about how, what, and why, right? So one of the things that, and we'll get to this a little in more depth, but one of the things that a good friend of mine talks about is this concept of eco-wellness, right? And he defines this as a sense of appreciation, respect for, and awe of nature that results in feelings of connection and with the natural environment and enhancement of holistic wellness. And so what he argues is that this is the missing component of our wellness models, right? That counselors use. We use a wellness model, right, to assess clients. And so he suggests that we think about understanding eco-wellness and our connection to nature as a part of the overall wellness inventory of a client, right? And so the other things he think about when he says, and he talks about in terms of developing your own practice, is having a 7 factors of eco-wellness in your own practice. And he says having a strong working knowledge of eco-wellness or ecotherapy, above and beyond informed consent, right? So we talk about that. Informed consent should look like, I have in mind a couple extra sentences that talk about my work and how it looks in the natural world, and how there are some, you know, things that could happen in nature, like we could trip and fall, get hurt. I have to make sure that my clients, I have to know about their medical history or if they have allergies. These are all things to think about and then discuss in your informed consent. Also to honor our client's nature worldview. So again, like you just don't want to take every client outside, to really get to, you know, talk and get to know the client first to make sure that that's part of what they are interested in doing. And protecting confidentiality, and again, this is a part of the ethical piece, right? So if you're walking in nature, I tend to walk on the same trail. It's kind of become my office. It's a perfect trail right by my house. It takes about an hour slowly to walk all the way around, and it's typically pretty empty. But I have conversations with my clients before we go about confidentiality, right? So what happens when if we're talking about something emotionally tense and somebody walks by? What if we're feeling emotional? You know, usually if I find someone getting emotional, we might go and sit someplace a little bit off the trail just so that we can have some privacy if they're feeling those emotions and expressing them. Maybe they're crying or something like that. And so those are the things that we talk about. We also talk about, like, what if they run into somebody that they know, and how do they want to introduce me? And we have those conversations before we even start. So we're clear with clients about the clinical intent of why we do what we do, and client advocacy, and we have access to safe places in nature, right? So that's something to think about. Again, we'll talk about ethical considerations. So as I mentioned before, but again, I'll say it, you know, informed consent includes language for outdoor therapies. We talk about confidentiality. Check with your insurance carriers and liability insurance. You might need additional insurance if that's possible. So check with them about their policies. So be prepared, and know your office. So you never want to take a client out into the natural world if you haven't mapped out where you're going. And if you don't know it perfectly, the last thing you want to do is get lost with your client, and not be able to make everything that much more stressful, right? So that's just cannot happen, right? So being prepared also means that you screen your clients for things, like all things, their health, their allergies, their fears, their comfort level, and you're protecting yourself and your client. Carry a phone, a first aid kit. I have like really nerdy fanny pack that my children don't like being seen with me with, but it's awesome. And it was $20 on Amazon. And I have a tiny little first aid kit. I put in there, I have my phone. I always bring extra like granola bars or like little snacks. And it also fits like 2 bottles of water. So one for me and maybe one for the client. I always bring an extra layer, and that's really important depending on where you're at. Knowing your weather, right? Knowing what's going to happen. I mean, if it's going to rain or pour, you might not want to do it. Being prepared, although sometimes getting caught in the rain can be really therapeutic. But making sure you have those things and you know what you're doing. And if possible, get first aid training too. I mean, I don't suggest taking anybody out, you know, on massive hikes, right? We're just, for the most part, we're either sitting at the beach or we're taking a walk through the woods, or we're fishing, right? My friend here, these are two of my favorite students. One of my friends, Kristen, the one I was telling you about, she brings her clients paddle boarding. It's wonderful. I'll tell you about her in a little while. So how do we do that, right? Ask specific questions in the intake interview about the client's connection to nature. Find out about it, right? Start small, you know? Maybe have nature spaces, things about in nature in your office. Make use of nature as a metaphor. There's so many metaphors in nature that we can talk about. I'll give you an example. One of my friends took a young boy who had a lot of trauma in his life out into the natural world, and as they were walking, there was a tree that fell on the ground and it was rotting, but from the tree came a new growth, right? And the child stopped and looked at it and said, that tree is just like me, right? So those kind of metaphors can be so powerful. I remember walking with another client, and she was walking, like her life was stressed and she was going 1,000,000 miles an hour, and I was keeping up with her, you know, and she stopped and there was a caterpillar. It was just moving across the ground, and I'm sure the caterpillar, by the way, was like sprinting, but in our perspective, it looked really like it was really going really slow. And she took a deep breath and she said, I need to slow down, right? So this is the thing about metaphors that we can do in nature. And you can always green your office space. That's another way, like we talked about. Talk about eco grief and climate stress with your clients. Include some mindfulness practices. Like some of my friends like do yoga with their clients in nature. You can do art-based nature activities together, especially with your kids. You can assign nature-based homework to clients, like have them really think about a special place and where they like to be. They might choose something in nature that represent themselves. I learned from a technique from Kristen again, where she has clients pick 3 things up in nature, something that reminds them of their past, their present, and their future, and they talk about it. They can take pieces of nature home with them. I always advocate not to take anything alive, right? So if there's something on the ground, they can pick it up and take it with them. And as you get to know your clients, like have them level up to reciprocal healing in the natural world. And developing an ecological self-care plan, which is something that I wanted to talk a little bit about that with you, which is, thinking about what a self-earth care plan, it might look different from all of us. We might need to start with really small, manageable steps. I mean, I'd like to save the world tomorrow, but okay, what can we do right now? And think about a plan that you can commit to and feel good about. Maybe it's just taking a walk in nature a few days a week right now and seeing what that's like. Maybe it's volunteering with an environmental group. I volunteer with the Monmouth County Park System. Maybe it's organizing, or if that's what you're good at, or setting up initiatives, local initiatives. And so, as counselors, we know the importance of self-care and setting boundaries and making realistic expectation, and not just for our clients, for us too. So we have to make sure that we take care of ourselves in all those aspects. And this is Kristen, and she has a practice called Jersey Shore Ecotherapy, and she's been doing the work in New Jersey for years. And this is her beautiful picture on how to be an ecotherapist, and you have that in your handout, and I just love it. And my love, of course, is ecotherapy in the classroom. So I teach a class at Monmouth about ecotherapy, and my current research is about incorporating ecotherapy into counselor education. My students and we get to do all kinds of great things throughout the semester. We start talking about the theory, but then we do some work on a farm, and then we do some equine therapy. Then we've done some nature-based art therapy. We've worked in a senior center and done some horticultural therapy. We did a ropes course. We did some archery. We've done all kinds of really cool things. Last semester, we actually, went and spent a night outside. It was freezing, but some of us survived that. And my research on this found like a lot of themes about it, and that the connections that we have together as a group are really incredible during this class. Our counselor identity shifts, our emotional reaction to nature. Some of my students talk about how they feel more connected to nature and are okay with being alone in nature now. And that they have a heightened awareness of their senses, right? And they love, most people, even my real bugophobes, can appreciate even spending some time in nature and feeling the stress. When we get to go out and sit in nature for class, it's some of the only times that my students, and you all know this, get 5 minutes to just sit down, right? We don't get that very often. And finally, here are some great books that I recommend reading. Outdoor Therapies, the blue book at the bottom is coming out soon. I wrote a chapter in that. It's got some really cool chapters about ecotherapy through an Indigenous perspective, and also surfing. And so that's really cool. Florence Williams, who wrote the Nature Fix, also did an Audible original called The 3-Day Effect. I loved it. It's like 6 hours long. I'd highly recommend listening to it. And then finally, for shameless self-promotion, this is the book I wrote. I really geared it toward counselors, right? Because there was a lot of work out there about psychologists or other things, but I really wanted to have a space for counselors to stop and think. And it's on Amazon, and I just found out they recorded it, and now it's actually an audible book. That's kind of cool. I didn't read it. Somebody else read it. So if you like to listen to books, you can do it that way. And I love that. For me, so many Monmouth University people were a part of the process and wrote pieces with it. And I think that just for me is really special. And that's it, my friends.